If you asked me to point out the exact moment my family decided I was an extra in my own life, it would be my 13th birthday. Not the one where I blew out candles, opened presents, and got a happy birthday song. No, that year, my parents left for vacation without me. A real vacation. Sun, cocktails, postcards, the works. I got a note on the fridge that said, "Stay at a friend's house. Back in a week. Love you." Except they forgot to mention which friend was supposed to host me. At first, I thought it was a mix-up. I sat on the porch with my backpack, waiting for a car to pull up, maybe my aunt or grandma. No one came. Hours passed. Streetlights flickered on. My neighbor's dog barked at me like I was loitering. Eventually I went inside, microwaved a frozen burrito, and realized, oh, they really meant it. I was not invited to my own family trip. It wasn't like I hadn't seen the favoritism before. My older brother Jason was the golden boy, varsity jacket, brand new bike, tutors for every subject. My younger sister Lily had ballet lessons, braces, and birthday parties with pony rides. Me? I got responsible middle child, stickers and the occasional reminder to mow the lawn. But this? Leaving me behind on purpose? That was a new level of, oops, wrong kid. The week they were gone was the loneliest of my life. I slept on the couch because the house felt haunted when it was too quiet. I biked to the library just to sit in air conditioning and pretend the silence wasn't chewing on my ribs. Sometimes I'd imagine they'd call, maybe say, "Surprise, we're joking!" But the phone never rang. By day 5, I was convinced this was permanent. That maybe they'd driven off into the sunset, looked at each other, and thought, 2 kids is enough. Let's just forget the spare. On day 6, everything changed. I was walking home from the library, clutching a stack of books like armor, when a shiny black car slowed down next to me. I froze, because in my neighborhood, shiny cars meant either bad news or wrong turn. The window rolled down and I saw a familiar face, older but sharper. "Kiddo? That you?" It was my Uncle Richard. The wealthy one. The one who hadn't been to Thanksgiving in a decade because, according to Mom, he was too arrogant for family gatherings. Which, in retrospect, probably meant he had boundaries. He looked me up and down, frowning at my backpack stuffed with overdue library books. "Why are you walking home alone at this hour? Where's your mom and dad?" I laughed. The kind of laugh that sounds like a cough. "Florida. With Jason and Lily." His jaw actually dropped. "And they just left you?" "Pretty much." He muttered something under his breath about unbelievable, and same as your father back in the day. Then he told me to get in the car. My brain screamed stranger danger, but my stomach screamed louder. It had been 3 nights of ramen noodles. I slid into leather seats that smelled like money and cologne. The air conditioning blasted like heaven. He drove me to a diner, ordered me the kind of dinner I'd only seen in commercials: burger, fries, milkshake. When the waitress set it down, I nearly cried. That night, Uncle Richard asked more questions than my parents had in the last year combined. About school, friends, what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told him half-jokingly. "Alive." He didn't laugh. Just looked at me for a long time and said, "You're coming with me." And just like that, my life divided into before and after. Before, the forgotten kid on the porch. After, the nephew of a man who actually noticed I existed. I didn't know it then, but that car ride wasn't just a rescue. It was the start of a 15-year apprenticeship in how to build a life. One day, it would all come to a head, in a lawyer's office, with my parents sitting across from me expecting millions. But that's getting ahead of myself. For now, I was just a scrawny 13-year-old, sitting in a booth with ketchup on my face, realizing someone finally gave a damn. Moving in with Uncle Richard wasn't like moving in with family. It was like being dropped into a different planet, one where the oxygen smelled like polished wood and fresh coffee instead of microwaved leftovers and resentment. The first night at his place, I sat stiffly on the edge of a guest room bed that felt like it was made out of marshmallows. He poked his head in and said, "You planning to sleep sitting up like a vampire?" I muttered something about not wanting to mess up the sheets. He blinked, then actually laughed. Kid, it's called laundry. Bedsheets aren't sacred. That was the first lesson. In his house, things were meant to be used, not feared. At breakfast, he poured me orange juice in an actual glass. At home, we drank out of old plastic souvenir cups from carnivals. When I hesitated, he raised an eyebrow. It's juice, not a contract. Drink. He asked about school, and I braced myself for the usual comparison, Jason gets straight A's, why can't you? Lying. Instead, he asked what subjects I liked. I froze. No one had ever asked that like it mattered. History, I admitted. But only the weird parts. Like, Napoleon was 5'6", but everyone thought he was tiny. Richard chuckled. You like the stuff people get wrong. That hit me harder than it should have. For once, someone wasn't correcting me, just noticing me. Of course, the transition wasn't smooth. I wasn't used to kindness. When he bought me new clothes, I folded the tags into a drawer because I figured he'd want to return them. When he handed me cash for lunch, I hoarded it like a squirrel and skipped meals so I wouldn't waste it. By week 2, he caught me eating dry cereal at midnight. Why aren't you using the fridge like a normal human? He asked, standing in the doorway in sweatpants that probably cost more than my old bike. I shrugged. I don't want to, take too much. He stared at me for a long second, then opened the fridge and pulled out leftover pasta. He shoved it in the microwave, plated it, and slid it across the counter. Here's the deal, if it's in my house, it's yours too. Got it? I nodded, chewing, trying not to cry into the spaghetti. When my parents came back from Florida, I half expected them to show up, banging on Richard's door demanding I return like lost luggage. But days turned into weeks, and no one came. No call, no message. Apparently, Jason's new beach photos and Lily's seashell collection were more exciting than checking if their middle kid was alive. Richard, on the other hand, kept showing up. He attended a school meeting with me, the first adult to ever sit beside me in one. The teacher asked if he was my guardian. He said, I am now. Just like that. He had money, sure. But what stunned me was how casually he used it to fill holes I didn't even know were there. A desk for homework. Glasses when I failed an eye exam. A dentist appointment I didn't know I needed. Not once did he say, you owe me. He just called it maintenance. Slowly, the permanent knot in my stomach loosened. I started getting decent grades. I stopped flinching every time someone said my name, expecting a lecture. And at night, when I lay on that marshmallow bed, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the disposable kid after all. Still, a part of me stayed cautious. Because if parents could ditch you like an expired coupon, what stopped anyone else? It would take years to fully trust that Richard wasn't waiting for me to mess up so he could toss me back. But for the first time in 13 years, I had a shot at something I'd never had before, a future. And while my parents were busy posting vacation albums, I was building something they couldn't see. Something that, one day, would make their jaws hit the floor in a lawyer's office. By the time I hit 14, Uncle Richard had decided 2 things about me. 1, I had terrible posture. 2, I had potential, even if it was hiding under my slouch. He tapped the back of my shoulders whenever I hunched. You're not a question mark, kid. Stand up straight. People believe you more when you look like you believe yourself. At school, teachers noticed the difference almost instantly. I wasn't the invisible kid anymore, at least, not completely. I started raising my hand in class. I even joined debate club, mostly because Richard bribed me with pizza if I'd at least try. He showed up to my first meet in a tailored suit, clapping louder than anyone else when I managed to argue that cats were objectively better than dogs. At home, he was less like a guardian and more like a one-man motivational seminar. But instead of cheesy posters, he taught through action. He dragged me along to meetings, tell me to watch how people spoke, how they shook hands. Half of success is tone and grip, he said once. The rest is showing up when no one else does. Of course, I was still a kid. I tested boundaries. Once I stayed out too late at a friend's place, didn't call. When I finally crept into his house at midnight expecting a lecture, he just handed me a sandwich and said, Glad you're alive. Next time, text. Otherwise, I'll assume you're in a ditch and have to hire a search party. His calm was scarier than yelling. I never skipped the check-in again. Money was never thrown at me. He could have spoiled me rotten, but he didn't. When I wanted a new video game, he said, "Cool. Get a job." So I did, bagging groceries at the corner store. My first paycheck was $68, and I waved it at him like it was a lottery win. He grinned, took me to the bank, and taught me how to open an account. "Save half, spend half," he told me. "That way you can enjoy today without bankrupting tomorrow." I rolled my eyes then, but those words stuck. Later, when my parents came sniffing around for handouts, that lesson was why I didn't crumble. The weirdest adjustment was holidays. My first Christmas at Richard's was surreal. I expected indifference. Maybe a polite gift card. Instead, he got me a leather journal with my initials embossed. Nothing flashy, just thoughtful. "Write down what you notice," he said. "Even the dumb stuff. Especially the dumb stuff." Meanwhile, my parents sent a group text photo, Jason unwrapping a new laptop, Lily holding designer boots. No mention of me. No Merry Christmas. Just a digital reminder that I was erased from their highlight reel. I thought it would break me. Instead, I looked at the journal in my lap and realized something wild. I wasn't jealous. I was relieved. I didn't want back in their world. By 16, Richard trusted me enough to help at his office during summers. It wasn't glamorous, filing papers, running errands, trying not to jam the copier, but it felt like stepping into a life I could claim. The suits scared me at first. Everyone looked like they'd been born knowing how to tie ties and say, "Synergy," with a straight face. I squeaked through my first introduction, voice cracking like a broken kazoo. Later, Richard pulled me aside. "Relax. They put their pants on one leg at a time. Some of them even fall over doing it. Don't let the ties fool you." That joke carried me through every awkward handshake that summer. By senior year, I had something I never thought possible: confidence. Not the loud, Jason-style swagger that came from being spoiled. Mine was quieter, like a lamp left on in the dark. Enough to guide me forward. I still kept an eye on my parents from afar. Social media was a highlight reel of their perfect family. Vacations, graduations, Lily's ballet recitals. My name never appeared. But I didn't ache anymore. Their silence wasn't a wound. It was proof that I'd built something stronger elsewhere. And Richard? He never tried to replace my dad. He didn't need to. He just showed up. Again and again. Like a steady drumbeat reminding me that I mattered. One night, right before I left for college, we sat on his balcony overlooking the city lights. He handed me a glass of soda, clinked his whiskey against it, and said, "You've come a long way from that kid waiting on a porch with a backpack." I laughed. "Yeah. Still can't believe you stopped for me that day." He shrugged, but his eyes softened. Best wrong turn I ever made. I didn't know it yet, but 15 years later those words would echo in a room where my parents finally remembered I existed, sitting across from me, waiting for millions that would never come their way. College wasn't supposed to happen for me. At least, not in the version of life my parents had mapped out. Jason was the university track. Lily was dance conservatory material. And I was the figure it out yourself kid. If it hadn't been for Richard, my tuition would have been a fantasy scribbled on napkins. He didn't just cut a check. He sat me down with spreadsheets, charts, and a lecture that made me wish I'd faked the flu. Scholarships first. Grants second. Then my help fills the cracks. "You're not coasting through 4 years on my wallet alone, kid. You're going to own this." So I applied for every scholarship under the sun. Some were weird, like one for left-handed students. I learned to write lefty in 2 weeks, and another for descendants of beekeepers. I wrote a heartfelt essay about honey even though my only experience was getting stung at age 8. I landed enough small awards that, combined, made a dent. Richard covered the rest, with one condition. "If you drop out to become a professional kazoo player, I want a full refund." On move-in day, He carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs like it was a corporate retreat workout. Parents around us snapped photos, hugged, cried. Mine didn't show. Not a text. Not even a thumbs-up emoji. I should have been crushed. Instead, I looked at Richard sweating in his $1,000 sneakers and thought, this guy cares more about my future than they ever did. College was awkward at first. I felt like an imposter with my thrift store sheets and nervous smile. But I learned fast. I joined student groups, made friends who didn't know me as the forgotten kid, and even landed an internship. Every week, I'd call Richard to update him. He never acted bored. Sometimes he'd interrupt with sarcastic applause through the phone. Look at you, Mr. Dean's List. Try not to get too famous before finals. By sophomore year, I had a reputation as the reliable one, the kid who showed up early, stayed late, didn't flake. Funny how the thing that once made me invisible at home became my strongest card in the real world. Richard never let me forget balance, though. When I stressed too hard, he'd drag me out for dinner. You can't save the world if you burn out before dessert, he said over steak one night. I rolled my eyes, but secretly, I needed that reminder. Meanwhile, my parents kept broadcasting their highlight reel. Jason posted about law school acceptances. Lily uploaded dance recitals. In their world, I didn't exist. I was a ghost scrolling through their feed, shaking my head. But ghosts can build empires. By graduation, I wasn't just walking across a stage. I had job offers, real ones, with salaries that made my grocery store paychecks look like Monopoly money. Richard sat in the front row, clapping so loud the dean gave him side-eye. After the ceremony, he handed me a pen. Not for signing autographs. For contracts. Use it wisely. I landed at a mid-size firm in operations. First day, I walked in with a suit 2 sizes too big and shoes that squeaked on every tile. I thought I'd be laughed out of the building. Instead, I found out squeaky shoes don't matter when you actually work hard. Within months, my name started popping up in meetings. I stayed quiet, listened, and when I did speak, I made it count. Every time I hit a milestone, promotion, raise, even just surviving a brutal week, Richard was there. Sometimes with advice, sometimes with whiskey, sometimes with a sarcastic, "About time you caught up, kid." And slowly, I built something my parents couldn't have imagined. Independence. Stability. A life not defined by scraps, but by choice. Still, the absence of family never fully stopped stinging. Holidays came and went. My inbox stayed empty. But I learned to fill the gaps differently. Friends who became chosen family, mentors who believed in me, and a man who had once pulled over on a random street and decided I mattered. I didn't know it yet, but every step I took in those years was laying the foundation for the day my parents would finally look me in the eye again. Not with pride, but with desperation, as the lawyer's voice turned the air to glass. By my mid-20s, life had done a complete 180. I went from the kid microwaving ramen in silence to the guy co-leading meetings where people actually took notes when I spoke. My name showed up in reports, my email filled with questions instead of orders, and I finally had an apartment that didn't come with free mold in the corners. Richard never let me get too cocky. "Nice job, hotshot," he'd say when I told him about a promotion. "But don't forget, I can still ground you." And honestly, I believed him. I worked in operations at a growing logistics firm, which basically meant solving problems no one else wanted to deal with. Broken supply chains, angry clients, systems that moved slower than dial-up internet. I became the guy who quietly fixed things. My coworkers called me the firefighter. I didn't have the loudest voice, but when everything went wrong, I was the one people called. Every time I thought about how far I'd come, I circled back to one truth. If Richard hadn't stopped his car that day, none of this would have happened. He was still my anchor. We met up weekly, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for coffee, and every time he checked in like it was second nature. But around then, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. He was getting older. It was in the little things at first. The way he rubbed his shoulder after carrying groceries, how he needed reading glasses for menus, the occasional cough he brushed off with a wave of his hand. One evening, I caught him staring too long at a bottle of pills on the counter. When I asked, he shrugged. Blood pressure. Comes with the territory of being alive too long. He laughed it off, but I felt a knot in my stomach. Still, he refused to slow down. He came to my first conference presentation, sat in the front row in a suit sharp enough to cut glass. Afterward, he shook my hand in front of everyone and said, "This guy used to sleep in libraries because no one else wanted him. Now he's running the show." I wanted to crawl into the carpet, but also, I'd never been prouder. Meanwhile, my parents continued their Broadway show of selective memory. On social media, Jason was thriving as a lawyer in training, Lily was touring with her dance company. Every family picture looked like a stock photo titled "Happiness for Sale." My name still didn't appear. Not even in the fine print. And yet I stopped checking for it. Their erasure wasn't my wound anymore, it was their pattern. If they couldn't acknowledge me when I was struggling, they didn't deserve to pretend they raised me when I was succeeding. Richard, on the other hand, made sure I remembered where I started. Once, after I got a raise, he slid an envelope across the table at dinner. Inside was the receipt from the first pair of work shoes he ever bought me at 14. "Frame it," he said, "so you never forget who you are under the suit." I kept that receipt pinned above my desk. Not as a guilt trip, but as proof of the bridge between who I was and who I'd become. But the shadow of time kept creeping in. Richard began canceling the occasional dinner, blaming work fatigue. I offered to reschedule, but he brushed it off with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And though he never admitted it, I knew something was changing. There was a heaviness to his movements, like he carried more than just the weight of his years. And though I didn't realize it then, those quiet signals were the first pages of the chapter that would end with me sitting in a lawyer's office, my parents across the table, expecting millions, only to hear a single line that would flip their world upside down. For now, though, I chose not to press. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I still needed him to be invincible. After all, for me, he always had been. It started small, the kind of things you convince yourself are nothing. Richard canceled more dinners. He claimed he was too busy, but his calendar had never stopped him before. One night, when I dropped by unannounced, I found him asleep in his armchair at 8 p.m. TV buzzing softly. He jolted awake, embarrassed, muttering something about long day. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the truth was in the way he held the railing when he walked upstairs, in the extra beat it took him to stand, in the little pill organizer that sat on the counter like a silent witness. I pretended not to notice. He pretended it wasn't happening. That was our quiet pact. Still, he never stopped being Richard. Even tired, he had a way of pulling me aside, making me see bigger. "You're doing well at work," he told me one evening after I'd ranted about a project. "But remember, jobs will replace you in a week. People won't, if you pick the right ones." It hit harder than any quarterly review. By then, I was climbing fast. Promotions came quicker, my name carried weight, and my calendar filled with meetings that once would have terrified me. But no matter how busy I got, I always found time for Richard. He wasn't just family. He was the reason I had a shot at any of it. Around my 29th birthday, I noticed he'd lost weight. Too much. He brushed it off with jokes. "Finally shedding that winter coat," he'd say, patting his stomach. But his laugh sounded thin. I offered to drive him to the doctor. He waved me off. "Doctors just tell you what you already know. Eat less salt, walk more, stop yelling at the news. I'm fine." He wasn't. A few months later, he collapsed at his office. Nothing dramatic, just fainted in a boardroom, like his body decided it had had enough. He was hospitalized overnight. When I visited, he grinned through the wires and monitors. "Don't look so serious. I told them I just wanted a free night's stay. Perks of old age." But behind the grin, I saw the truth. And for the first time, I realized he wasn't invincible. That night, sitting by his hospital bed, he turned serious. "You know, I always figured your dad would be the one teaching you all this stuff. But I'm glad it was me." I swallowed hard. "Don't talk like that." He smirked. "Like what?" Honest? He shifted, wincing slightly. Listen, kid. Life's short. But you've already outpaced every expectation anyone had for you. I just want you to remember, you're not the spare. You never were. I blinked fast, because crying in front of him felt like cheating. He must have noticed anyway, because he added, If you ruin my sheets with tears, I'm sending you the dry cleaning bill. Typical Richard. Even in pain, he had to land a joke. He recovered enough to go home, but something in the air had shifted. We both knew time was shorter than either of us wanted to admit. The last holiday we spent together, he gave me a small box. Inside was the leather journal he'd given me at 14, the one with my initials embossed. Except now it was filled. Not with my writing, but his. Notes, advice, sarcastic comments, even random doodles. On the last page, in his blocky handwriting, he wrote, If they ever tried to erase you again, remember this, you've already written your own chapter. I didn't understand the weight of those words then. Not fully. But months later, in that lawyer's office, they would come roaring back, just as every head in the room snapped toward me. Richard passed quietly, in his sleep, on a Tuesday morning. I got the call before dawn, his assistant's voice trembling on the line. For a long moment, I just sat there on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, trying to understand how the world could still spin without him in it. I handled the funeral arrangements because of course I did. There was no one else who knew his favorite hymns, the suit he actually liked, or that he hated lilies and preferred plain roses. The man had pulled me out of the gutter at 13. The least I could do was make sure his send-off wasn't a Pinterest disaster. The service was small, dignified. His colleagues showed up in dark suits, people who respected him not because he was wealthy but because he was steady. A few old friends shared stories, some hilarious, some sharp enough to sting. And then, right when I thought I'd get through the day intact, my parents walked in. Jason led the way, tall and smug in his lawyer suit, Lily trailing behind with sunglasses big enough to hide 3 different hangovers. And there, clutching each other like they'd lost their best friend instead of the uncle they hadn't spoken to in decades, were my parents. My mother had perfected the wounded widow act, even though she wasn't the widow. My father shook hands like a politician, nodding at people he didn't know. They didn't look at me until halfway through the service. When they did, it was like they'd seen a ghost. I gave a polite nod, nothing more. After the burial, they cornered me near the reception table. My mom clutched my arm. Oh, sweetheart. We had no idea you were so close to him. I pulled back slightly. You didn't ask. My dad cleared his throat, putting on his solemn patriarch voice. Your uncle was a remarkable man. Generous. Successful. Truly part of the family. That last word almost made me laugh. Family. They'd left me behind at 13 with a sticky note on the fridge. But now, standing in the shadow of Richard's estate, suddenly I was worth acknowledging. Jason chimed in, trying for casual. So, any idea when the will reading is? I mean, Uncle Richard was, well, loaded. He said it like we were discussing the weather. Lily sighed dramatically. I just hope he wanted us to keep the family legacy intact. Houses, cars, that kind of thing. You know he always cared about appearances. I stared at them. For a moment, I wasn't sure if they were real or extras in some bad sitcom. My uncle's body hadn't even been in the ground a full day, and they were circling like vultures. I didn't answer. I just walked away, leaving them mid-sentence. Over the next week, the calls started. My parents, suddenly eager to reconnect. Jason leaving voicemails about responsibility to the family. Lily texting me heart emojis like we'd ever had a real relationship. It was almost funny, if it hadn't been so transparent. Meanwhile, the lawyer handling Richard's estate contacted me. The reading was scheduled for the following Monday. It will be eventful, he warned with a wry tone. Your uncle was very clear about his wishes. That night, I sat at my desk with the filled journal Richard had left me. I flipped to the last page again. If they ever tried to erase you again, remember this, you've already written your own chapter. For the first time since his death, I smiled. Because I knew what was coming. and I knew my parents weren't ready for it. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old money. Dark wood paneling, heavy curtains, chairs too stiff to be comfortable. My parents, Jason, and Lily sat on one side of the long table, their postures screaming entitlement dressed as grief. I sat on the other side, journal in my lap, heart pounding but face calm. The lawyer, Mr. Halpern, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Richard Carleton." His voice carried the kind of gravity that made even Jason sit straighter. He started with the formalities: debt settled, minor bequests to charities, a few gifts to longtime employees. My family shifted impatiently, like kids waiting for dessert. Finally, Halpern flipped a page and said, "Now, regarding the distribution of Mr. Carleton's estate." Jason smirked, leaning forward. Lily squeezed Mom's hand like they were about to win the lottery. My dad gave me a sideways glance, smug, as if daring me to look surprised. Halpern read slowly, each word dropping like a stone in water. "To my estranged relatives, who only remembered my existence in the shadow of my bank account, I leave nothing." The air cracked. Mom gasped. Jason's mouth actually fell open. Lily whispered, "He's joking, right?" Halpern didn't flinch. He turned another page. "To my nephew, Michael." He looked up at me, eyes warm. "Who was left behind at 13 but never left my side since. I leave the entirety of my estate, including all assets, properties, accounts, and holdings." The silence was deafening. Then, almost in unison, every head in the room snapped toward me. Jason sputtered first. This can't be legal. He barely even knew you." I tapped the journal in my lap. "Knew me well enough to fill 15 years of advice in here." My father's face reddened. "You manipulated him. You poisoned him against his family." I leaned back, calm as Richard had taught me. "You did that yourselves the day you left me behind with a note on the fridge." Lily tried a different tactic, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Come on, Mike. You can't honestly keep all of it. We're family." I smiled, not cruel, just tired. Funny. 15 years of silence didn't sound like family. But sure, now that there's money on the table. Halpern shut his folder with a decisive snap. "The will is airtight. Any contesting will be dismissed." Mr. Carleton was thorough. And just like that, it was done. I walked out of that office with Richard's words echoing in my head, "You're not the spare. You never were." For the first time in my life, I believed it. Behind me, I heard the rising voices of my family arguing with each other, scrambling to process the fact that their golden ticket had been torn up in front of them. I didn't look back. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and texted the one person who mattered. "Wish you were here to see their faces, old man." If heaven had Wi-Fi, I knew Richard would have laughed his head off.